This is the third video in a three-video series looking at the ethical abhorrence of the climate change disinformation campaign. The first video introduced the concept of the climate change disinformation campaign following now extensive sociological literature on the subject. The second video began to look at some of the tactics of this campaign. This third video will continue looking at specific tactics of this campaign. This video will also examine the distinction between reasonable climate skepticism, which should be encouraged, and disinformation, which is clearly ethically odious and obnoxious, given what's at stake with climate change. One of the kinds of organizations that have been created by the participants in the disinformation campaign are front groups. Front groups are groups with names that hide the real parties in interest. Front groups have been created by think tanks, corporations on climate change with such nice-sounding names as the Greening Earth Society, the Global Climate Coalition, the Cooler Heads Coalition. The very purpose of creating a front group is to hide the real parties in interest. Public relations professionals know that science coming from corporations will be viewed suspiciously. Therefore, organizations that hide the parties in interest are created. One prominent front group at least during the 1990s was the Global Climate Coalition. The Global Climate Coalition spent a lot of money during the 1990s trying to prevent climate change policies from being enacted. The real parties in interest were ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, and a host of industries whose interests would be affected economically if policies were adopted. These front groups, according to the literature, have engaged in a variety of different kinds of deceptive practices. In April of 2009, the New York Times reported that the Global Climate Coalition, while it was engaged in the very process of trying to undermine consensus about mainstream climate science, had been advised by its own scientific advisors that the consensus view was entitled to respect. And so the front groups have often been single-handedly focusing on undermining the mainstream view, not doing responsible skepticism, not trying to get at the truth of climate science, but creating disinformation. Another kind of organization that has played a prominent role in the disinformation campaigns is public relations firms. Public relations firms have frequently been hired by other participants in the disinformation campaign to create a campaign to convince people that the mainstream scientific view of climate change is not supportable. The PR firms bring very sophisticated tools to this effort, such as focus group work. The PR campaign are often engaged in creation of disinformation. Another tactic frequently used by the disinformation campaign is to accuse mainstream scientists of doing bad science or unsound science. Unsound science is a term developed by a public relations firm with focus groups. It's a term to try to get the public to see the science as being bad science. When one looks more closely at these claims, one finds often that these claims are based upon the very controversial notion that science is always bad unless it's fully proven. Insisting upon full proof will mean that nothing is ever done about human-induced warming because the climate system is very complex and some uncertainties will always remain. Another kind of organization frequently participating in the disinformation campaign is generally referred to as an AstroTurf group. An AstroTurf is a fake grassroots group. They are created to give the false impression that there's a spontaneous, just normal people movement opposing climate science or climate policies, when in fact the organization has been funded and organized by people with economic interests who would be harmed by climate policies. This is clearly disinformation, this is deception, this is clearly ethically and morally offensive. Perhaps the most vicious, odious tactic of some of the people engaged in the disinformation campaign is cyberbullying journalists and scientists. There are websites whose funding can be traced back to fossil fuel interests that often contain the pictures and personal emails of journalists and scientists that have written something that can be construed in support of action on climate change. These websites then, at least implicitly, encourage people to attack these scientists and journalists. The scientists and journalists then very quickly receive hundreds of very nasty, non-substantive attacks, including nasty death threats. This is obviously ethically and morally obnoxious. This is not responsible skepticism. In addition to trying to prevent action on climate change by undermining the science, the disinformation campaign also makes very faulty, ethically problematic economic arguments. They claim that action on climate change will destroy jobs, destroy GDP, and in so doing, they ignore the enormous costs of doing nothing. They ignore the fact that polluters have a duty not to harm others. They ignore the fact that polluters, by most ethical theories, have a duty to pay for the cost of their pollution. And the economic arguments also contain other deeply ethical problems with the economic claims. We've now examined ethically odious tactics of the disinformation campaign that have largely been funded by fossil fuel companies, other corporations, or philanthropic organizations that pursue free market ideology. Not all participants have participated equally. Some have participated in some projects and not in others. But all of these people are pursuing economic interests and ignoring duties, responsibilities, and obligations, and in so doing, as we've seen, use deceptive practices to try to protect their economic interests. In 2009, a controversy that was quickly dubbed the Emailgate scandal broke out. The disinformation campaign was extraordinarily successful in spreading word around the world that this scandal proved that the entire scientific basis for concern about climate change was a fraud and a hoax. The scandal involved hacked emails from the University of East Anglia, scientists who were communicating with several American scientists. The Emailgate scandal was investigated by many prestigious scientific organizations, which eventually completely exonerated the participants in the Emailgate scandal. It became obvious that not only did some of the world's most prestigious scientific organizations exonerate the participants in the Emailgate scandal, it became clear that even if the original assertions were true, it would not undermine the vast scientific basis for the consensus view. And so we've seen that the disinformation campaign has been engaged in a variety of tactics that are deeply ethically reprehensible, including reckless disregard of the truth, cherry-picking the science, and the other tactics mentioned in this series. The campaign was also involved in other things, lobbying, creation of websites with lots of false information, and funding politicians that would support their position. Given the enormity of the threat to tens of millions of the world's poorest people, the kind of suffering they may endure through famine, droughts, floods, loss of food supply, the kind of deception we have seen in the disinformation campaign is strikingly ethically and morally odious. On the other hand, people might argue that those participating in the disinformation campaign are simply exercising the right to free speech. But free speech is not absolute. People have a duty not to spread misleading information about really dangerous behavior. It would be ethically, obviously odious for someone to tell a girl laying on the railroad track that no train is coming when the person saying that no train is coming did not look very carefully to assure that the train was not coming. However, not everyone participating in the disinformation campaign is equally ethically blameworthy. However, those corporations that have been hiring public relations firms, using front groups, AstroTurf groups, and otherwise supporting disinformation are obviously ethically blameworthy. They have violated the duty to be careful about something so dangerous. How do we classify the behavior of the disinformation campaign in regard to some of the tactics that we've seen in this series, such things as hiring public relations firms to give the false impression that there's no scientific basis for concern about climate change? Is this some kind of new crime against humanity? Given what's at stake, given the harshness of the consequences, we need to think about this issue very seriously. Given everything we've discussed in this series about the disinformation campaign, one might ask, what should be done? 3 suggestions follow. 1 is we need a social movement that discusses the ethical abhorrence of the disinformation campaign. 2, we need to encourage international lawyers to think about how do we classify this campaign. And finally, we need to help people all around the world understand the difference between skepticism and disinformation. The evidence we now have about how the disinformation campaign has operated suggests that we need to create norms that will encourage scientific skepticism, but will require the skeptics play by the rules of science. In this regard, the norms would include, among other things, the requirement that skeptics submit all claims to peer review. Peer review is the process by which truth claims are tested in science. Skeptics should be required to submit claims from their discipline to institutions that have a breadth of interdisciplinary expertise, so that any one claim from one discipline can be tested in light of scientific information coming from other disciplines, all of which are contributing to our knowledge of climate change. We should strive to help all parties understand that decision-making in the face of uncertainty is not a value-neutral endeavor. It is an ethical question, and which raises a whole series of sub-ethical questions, including who should have the burden of proof and what quantitative proof should satisfy the burden of proof. We need to look at skepticism through an ethical lens.